You remember at the end of the last video, we said that Bruner's work led to the extensive use of manipulatives, and that is what we want to talk about in this video. So I'm going to be looking in your book on page 176 to 180 if you want to use that as a reference. So from the NCTM, we need to be prepared to use any number of different tools to promote learning and equity in our classrooms. So think about how manipulatives can do that. They promote learning. They go with Gardner's intelligences, bodily kinesthetic students, students who need to be active in their learning. The manipulatives help with that. As far as the stages of learning, that inactive and iconic, manipulatives work with that, but also for promoting equity. And you might not have thought of this as a way to promote equity, but in reality, since so many of your students are different from one another, it does help with that. So for example, your kid who's ADHD, having the manipulatives there gives them something active to do with their hands and their fingers, helps them stay on task, help them learn. For the student who has not yet developed as much, with they're still in a very concrete stage. They have not developed as much of that thinking that's not concrete. The manipulatives help them be able to access the material. So that equity issue is kind of hidden in there, but I do think that manipulatives help with that. Okay, now one thing I learned, and I will pass this learning along to y'all so you don't make the same mistakes I do, manipulatives always need to be tied to the symbolic. They should be self-eliminating. They are not an end to themselves. So, for example, by the time you get to the test, hopefully the student doesn't need the manipulative anymore. They have gotten to the point where they understand what they were supposed to have learned with the manipulative, and they're able to do it symbolically. You are very instrumental in that. The first time I did anything with manipulatives, and at my school that I first started teaching at, we didn't have any manipulatives on hand. Our budget was very low. It was a very poor school district. So we didn't have money for manipulatives, so I had to create my own. And so I had created these manipulatives for a graphing activity, passed them out to my students, so excited about it. And they did exactly what I wanted them to do. They saw the way the things worked. And then the next day, when I did not get the manipulatives out, they had no clue what they were supposed to do because I had not done a good job of helping them understand how these manipulatives that they were using went along with what we were going to be doing the next day without them. So it's really important as you do this that you are able to help the students see how what they're doing with their hands, how moving these pieces around helps them to be able to do whatever the activity is you want them to do without them. And you have to be very explicit about that. They're not going to just make the connection. Most of them are not going to make the connection themselves without you doing that. And manipulatives are not the focus of the lesson. Mathematics is the focus of the lesson. Manipulatives are just there to help the student learn the math. So you should not write as a goal, you should not write as an objective, the student will be able to use algebra tiles. The student will enjoy using the algebra tiles, neither affective nor cognitive. That manipulative, the using of the algebra tiles, is not a standard. That is not something we're trying to teach our students. What we're trying to teach our students is how to solve equations or how to add and subtract positive, negative numbers or whatever it is. And the manipulatives are helping us do that, but they are not themselves the focus of the lesson. So just be real cautious with those couple of things as you're working with the manipulatives. Okay, so it always comes up what is and is not a manipulative. So some people get manipulatives and tools mixed up. So I have here on this page some examples of things that are not manipulative. They are math tools. They are used to help your students do certain mathematical things, but they are not themselves manipulative. What makes something a manipulative is that it represents something else. It is that inactive, iconic thing that is standing for something symbolic that the students are going to do later. So I have some pictures of here of things we're going to use in class. I have some algebra tiles. I have some algebra blocks. Both of those we're going to practice with. Those are fairly expensive. You can buy them for your school. Some schools already have them. But what if you teach in a school like mine, where I first started? What if you teach in a school that doesn't have a large selection of manipulatives, can't really afford a large selection of manipulatives? There's nothing wrong with using pebbles or using pennies or using red pieces of construction paper and blue pieces of construction paper. There's all kind of ways you can get around the fact that your school cannot afford or does not happen to have the more expensive manipulatives. A manipulative is just something that stands for something else. So if you're going to let gray rocks represent positive numbers and brown rocks represent negative numbers, then great. Your students are going to learn exactly the same thing as the students do who are using these algebra tiles. It's just that theirs are yellow and red and yours are gray and brown. But the thought process is exactly the same. It doesn't really matter. All right, some tips for manipulative use. Allow free play. Okay, so this is one that I did not follow when I first started doing manipulatives. In fact, when I taught 8th grade at Saluda Trail was the first time I had seen the algebra blocks. I knew they would be powerful. I wish that I had had them when I taught in Georgia. I'm getting them out. I'm excited to share them with my students, and I'm trying to explain to them what they do, and they are building towers, and they are shifting them around on their papers, doing everything other than listening to me. So I learned a valuable lesson. I would set the timer for 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Okay, you guys can build, you can do whatever you want, but when the timer goes off, when that 2 minutes are up, we're doing math. And so allowing them that freedom actually seems like it would be a waste of time, but it really earned me a substantial amount of time because then they were ready to pay attention. You need to be sure to establish rules and procedures. This is the way we're going to take them out. This is the way we're going to put them away. It's always this person's responsibility or that person's responsibility. When I did again at Saluda Trail and I did the algebra blocks, I kept them under my students' desks and they understood that it was their responsibility. First thing we had to do was get them out and count them. And we had to make sure that everybody had the correct number. And then when they put them back in there, they knew the next class was coming in to count them again. So that really helped none of them to go missing. And it also helped for two people drop their blocks and they scattered all over the room. They could figure out who had which blocks because they knew both of us ought to have, 25 of the green ones, whatever it was. And again, we already said that manipulatives are not the focus. They're just there to help us out. Manipulatives should promote discussion and interaction. So you should be working with these, helping your students work with these, and discussing what you're doing as you go. And this last one I think is really important. Not every child likes manipulatives, wants manipulatives, needs manipulatives. Some students have a very symbolic way of thinking anyway, and it doesn't take them very long to get to the point where they don't want to use manipulatives. So again, when I was homeschooling, and homeschooling is a little bit different than traditional schooling because there are no bells. And so when we finished with whatever our assignment was for that day, we were finished, no matter how long it took us. So when we pulled out the manipulatives, sometimes my kids didn't want to use them because it extended their school day. They just didn't see why this was valuable. Usually what I would do with them, and both my kids are very mathematical, so they didn't need much, but I wanted them to see, hey, this is what happens. This is what moving these pieces around is representing. And now when you go solve that equation that I want you to solve, you can picture this and you understand why I want you to subtract 3 from both sides, divide by 2 on both sides, or whatever it was. My youngest is not quite as mathematically minded as his brother and sister, so sometimes I will do manipulative things with him. His teacher will explain it, and he will come home and be doing his homework, but still have some questions, still have some misunderstandings, and I can draw some things on his paper or pull out some pennies and nickels or whatever we need to do to help him understand what's going on and how this works. And then the light bulb clicks on in his head, and he understands it so much better. So every child is different. Every child will need a different amount of time with them. What I usually did is I put them under my desks, and then for however long we were going to be using the manipulatives, the first day everybody did it because I wanted them to see. And then after that first day, it was the student's choice whether to pull them out or not pull them out. And what would happen was on the second day, the majority of them were still pulling them out and moving them around. And as time progressed, fewer and fewer students needed to pull them out because they had moved to that symbolic representation and they just didn't need the manipulatives anymore. So next week when I see you guys, hopefully face to face, we are going to practice with some manipulatives and we'll talk about how to do some of these things that will help you establish good manipulative use in your